Hello, good evening. I'm Rudy L. Curry. I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture. I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us this evening for our Spring Term Salon. This is a series held every year in February, every Thursday of the month of February. It's curated by our Associate Dean of Research, Professor Sonia Chow. It's meant to promote and stimulate research in a particular area. So there's a theme every year. This year we are addressing the challenge of affordable housing, one of the big stressors that we face. And my colleague, Professor Chow, is going to tell you more about what she has for us tonight.
Thank you, Dean L. Curry, and as always, thank you for your support of this series and our research efforts at the School of Architecture. So as all of you may already know, this is the third in a series of lectures that we've had focused on affordable housing. The first one looked at policies, and we had some very distinguished guests that joined us from the U.S. Department of HUD's Washington and Atlanta offices. And we have with us, after that, we also had, that same evening we had some representatives from Miami-Dade County and talking to us about their efforts focused on affordable housing. And then we had another series more recently that I'm going to ask Madeline Lee and Gloria, where are you, my two co-curators, to tell you a little bit more about. And then Madeline will go ahead and introduce our moderator this evening, which is Sarah Cody, who is the Director of Historic Preservation for Miami-Dade County. So Madeline, would you like to join me? You've been very shy in doing so, but you've been a very important person in curating this along with me and Gloria. And so Gloria, come join us as well.
So welcome, nice to see everybody. So last week we had an opportunity to explore the question, but beyond the bottom line, what do we lose? What are the socioeconomic repercussions of losing affordable housing? And we had Hannah Eskra, who is president of Mirai Development, moderating a panel with Nicole Crooks from Catalyst Miami, the Overtown community manager, Albert Milo from Related Urban Development Group, and Robin Backen from the University of Miami's Office of Community and Civic Engagement. It was a very wonderful, rich conversation exploring different perspectives and different components of what does it mean to preserve affordable housing, how are communities brought into the picture, what is the economic reality of financing these projects. These conversations are all also available as recordings, which will be posted online to our university website soon. And before I go ahead and introduce the moderator, I did want to mention that we have a QR code set up. If you were here last week, we had some technical difficulties with it. But we encourage all of you to ask your questions. You know, after the panel conversation, we'll have the mic available. We really encourage you to ask your questions to the panelists, both while the panelists are sitting here, but also when we kind of conclude the discussion and continue into the second happy hour. But if you have particular burning questions during the discussion that you would really like to ask, you can use this QR code. There's an event code, which is the day of the month, the 15th, 2024, 152024, and then you can just submit a new question. I saw we've had some come in. We may not have a chance to get to all of the questions, but please do share, and we'll try to have them reach our moderator. But I guess without any further ado, Gloria. Gloria Shanahan is our partner at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Southeast region.
Thank you, Maddie, and thank you, Dean Curry and Professor Chow, and the entire team here for inviting HUD, for opening your doors to the Department of Housing and Urban Development to be part of this fantastic series. We have had conversations on many topics from many walks of life, and there are two pivotal items that I see in every single conversation, and one is that we all want our chosen hometown to remain sustainable, and that we want every single individual that wants to live here to have a dignified home. And so it's by mixing everyone's knowledge and experiences that we can find solutions, and this is a really exciting experiment, and thank you so much, and let's keep the conversation.
So our moderator for tonight is Sarah Cody. Sarah is the Chief of Historic Preservation for Miami-Dade County. And Sarah, you have a mic? Okay. And you have a mic?
Okay. Hi. Good evening. Thank you very much to UM School of Architecture and the Southeast Office of US HUD for hosting this evening. I'm Sarah Cody. I'm the Historic Preservation Chief for Miami-Dade County. And just a brief word about the work that we do at Miami-Dade County. As public servants and as historic preservation is recognized as a public benefit, we really work at Miami-Dade County to ensure that we are using the power of historic and cultural places to make our communities more equitable and more resilient. And that's our ultimate goal of what we're trying to achieve with historic preservation through the county. And with that, I'm also going to introduce our panelists next, and then we will get the conversation going. So first up, we have Associate Professor Eric Furley. Eric has been teaching at UM since 2011, and he is the director of the school's Master of Science program. Prior to this, he worked as an architect and urban designer in Paris and London. His own research focuses on housing, urban design, and cultural questions of architectural production. Next, we have Francisco Garcia. Francisco is an urban designer and planner. He's principal with the Euclid Group, which is a development consultancy with offices throughout South Florida. Francisco has extensive planning experience in both private and public sector, and he is formerly the planning and zoning director for the city of Miami. For a very impressive 10 years, he held that position. Next up, we have David Noguera. David is a housing and community development professional with experience in government and nonprofit sectors. He currently serves as the HUD Miami Director of Community Planning and Development, and he oversees grantees to 32 municipalities and over 100 nonprofits across South Florida. Next, we have George Hernandez. George is a professor at the University of Miami School of Architecture. He's been a professor here for many years. I won't say since how long, but for many, many years. And he runs the Preservation Certificate Program. So of course, George and I have known each other for many years in the world of historic preservation in Miami-Dade County. And last, but definitely not least, we have Dr. Sarbeshwar Praharaj. And he is an assistant professor at the University of Miami School of Architecture. He was previously the associate director of knowledge exchange for resilience at Arizona State University. Sarbeshwar received his PhD in urban planning from the University of New South Wales, Australia. So that's our panelists. That's who we're going to be hearing from today, or this evening. And the kind of specific question that we're looking at exploring this evening is, how do we reframe the design of cities to support sustainable and culturally connected housing alternatives? And so I thought, before we explore how to reframe the design of cities, let's maybe first ask ourselves, how does the design of cities inform or determine our housing options? Sarbeshwar, let's start with you, if you don't mind. So when we start to look at the overall design of our cities, how does the overall design determine critical outcomes like housing, like transportation? How can we start to understand the relationship between all these things?
Right, that's a complex question at the outset. Well, first of all, thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to be around such colleagues. So when you look at cities, and when you think of cities where we live, play, and work, often we say that cities are systems of systems. So when you're looking at housing, for example, that we are discussing and through this Salon series, when you are designing for cities where you want to design affordable housing, you want to have good quality housing that is accessible for a range of communities, you need to also look at the other systems that are at play while you are thinking about housing. What are the other systems that cities have that enable us to work, live, and play? For example, transportation, environment, and all these different elements interact with each other. And there are flows and networks between these that you need to explore to be able to answer the complex questions such as affordable housing. So for example, on the screen, you see a project that I led in Sydney, Australia, where we are looking at supporting the transport and housing department of the state of New South Wales in designing a new transit corridor. Now, we are modeling 6 years ahead of the project to understand how the new transit corridor or location of transit stations would impact the real estate market. Why we need to know that quite ahead of time? Why do we need to understand that nexus between the housing and transport? Because by doing that, you could understand how much value uplift you'll get from this new transit infrastructure. And so the government could then design the development fees, the taxes in accordingly to get some of the investment back that they can again channel back into the system, into things such as affordable housing, public spaces, and other stuff in terms of utilities. So when we start exploring the interactions between housing, transport, social infrastructure, for example, if you read Mike Barry's book, when we talk about cities as complex systems, Barry from UCL says that cities are, when you understand cities, they're essentially constellation of flows and networks. Now, those flows and networks are between social elements, between the people. So when we're talking about housing, transportation, we need to also look at the social systems that helps us sustain and grow in daily life. So we are talking about not just housing as a physical installation, but we are talking about public spaces, talking about community connections that are helpful to sustain and grow a community. So we are increasingly seeing across the world, in the developed world, that the span of home ownership are very limited. People are not living in one place for many years. What does that mean? How do we sustain communities over the time? We had a question on sustainability of affordable housing. So if we need to sustain, then we need to look at these interactions and try and exploit the opportunities that lie at the intersection of these different systems that cities have. So in terms of design, I would say that we need to have a fresh perspective into where we have gone wrong in terms of looking at these systems separately in silos, where across different departments and agencies, which makes up this system of the cities, are working separately, how they can come together and design solutions at the intersection of these opportunities.
Great, thank you. Francisco, building off this concept from Sarveshwar about housing being one system within a system, what are your thoughts on the relationship between the design of cities and land use regulations?
So the first thought that comes to mind is, as I hear Sarveshwar describe a city as a set of systems, and unquestionably a city is ultimately a set of systems. In my former role in the public sector as a regulator, it was part of my responsibility to calibrate the regulations that began to determine how the system is put in place and how the system sort of evolves. And I always found it challenging that looking at a city as a system tends to ignore, or doing so too much, tends to ignore the fact that once upon a time, towns, and as they developed into cities, were organic constructs. They happened the way they did because as they evolved, they had to respond to the needs of the community that lived in them. And that community was going to live in them for generations and generations and generations. Clearly, that's not the world today, at least certainly in our big cities. That's not the world today, and we have different realities that inform it. But unless we keep that relationship sort of present in mind, it is very simple to look, or very easy to deceive oneself into looking at a city only as a system and lose sight of the fact that it all has to work together in a way that responds to the desires of a community. So regulations are a curious thing. What comes to mind is in the city of Miami, just because it happens to be an example that I'm very familiar with, the city of Miami has approximately 75% of its land area zoned, designated for low-density residential. That's single-family or duplex residential. Densities of 9 units per acre, 18 units per acre. Now, and I hope that's not too technical, but let that sink in for a moment, and that is immensely wasteful. Now, not lost to me is the reality that all of that land ultimately translates into single-family residences or duplexes that form neighborhoods that people are very attached to and made an investment on and want to see that investment sort of prosper and hold its value. That said, as Miami inevitably grows, because it will, because it has to, one then is challenged to, over time, judiciously transform some of those low-density areas into whatever comes next, the next layer. Now, Miami is a young city. Miami has arguably 2 layers of development that respond to the different points in time in which these layers happened. And we're now approaching or in the middle of the 3rd layer. So how do we take this land that is presently low density in an infill environment, and how do we begin to transition to higher densities, a more sustainable set of development practices, and still maintain, to some extent, an environment that is satisfactory to those who live in it, the community that lives in it, right? That sort of cultural construct of community. And so, yes, every municipality in the United States has a zoning ordinance and a comprehensive plan. Through that zoning ordinance, to respond now to your question more specifically, one can calibrate the set of regulations to produce a desired result. There's a consensus process. These are public hearings. People are involved, etc. Elected officials begin to drive the process. But to connect, ultimately, the regulatory process to a working definition of what sustainable living is, sound communities are, that cultural construct is ultimately imperative. And I wanted to insert that into this conversation because to lose sight of it, I think, is to miss the point.
Absolutely, very well said. Thank you, Francisco. David, if we're looking at all these various components of the system coming together, what are the socioeconomic considerations that impact or inform our ability to provide housing that's culturally connected?
Is it on? Okay. Thank you for the question, and thank you for having me here. Let me start by saying I think it's very important that the University of Miami's School of Architecture is tackling this issue of affordable housing, because it's something that's near and dear to me. We at HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, we were created largely for this purpose. If you look at our history, if you look at the funding that the U.S. Congress allocates to HUD, it's created to support cities, it's created to support the urban environment largely, and the structures, the housing that comes from it. When you start to talk about the socioeconomic challenges that come from housing, you're really not just talking about the structures, but you're talking about the people who occupy them, the neighbors who have to live next to them. And what you find is that they don't always fit together. Right? Francisco started talking about this. If you ever played the game Sin City, where you're putting the puzzle pieces together, sometimes it can be challenging, right? What I've learned in my experience working with housing is that you have one component, which is a financial component. It's often a math exercise where you have to figure out how to make the numbers work in spite of the fact that the people that you're serving can't afford what it costs, right? But then on the other side, you have to look at, well, what's the support or the criticism or the challenges that are going to be in developing this housing? It can be environmental, either because you're too close to the coast, or you're in a flood zone, or you're near a waste dump, and is it right to put people to live next door to that? Or it can be in an area where residents have this perception that those people that may be occupying this housing are not the ones we feel comfortable with living next door to us or down the street from us. So a lot of what we end up doing goes much further beyond the math exercises, and a lot of education about what does this housing look like? How do we design it so that it fits in? How do we educate the residents about who these residents are going to be that are going to be occupying these spaces? It's a number of different factors like that that come into play when we're trying to develop housing, particularly at a citywide or level.
Thank you. And I have a follow-up question for you. And maybe this should have been the first question. Why do we care so much about the affordable housing being culturally connected to our communities? Why don't we just get a bunch of generic affordable housing, throw it in the lots where it fits, and why do we care? Why does it have to be sustainable? Why does it have to be culturally connected?
Good question. Why do we care? So I think there are a number of reasons that we should care. And it starts with understanding the needs that we have in our community. I didn't even get to my slides because I think your questions changed a little bit. But when you look at who is serving your coffee, when you look at who is teaching your children, when you look at who is working on construction sites, when you look at all of the different people that make up your community that allow it to thrive in one way, shape, or form, those people don't necessarily make what we call the median income for an area, right? The higher that median income is, the harder it is to attract people to jobs to fill those services. I read an article recently about Martha's Vineyard, which is a very high-cost community. It's an island off the coast of Massachusetts. And it was talking about how the local hospital was having trouble recruiting doctors because they couldn't afford housing in Martha's Vineyard. So you had the hospital getting in the housing business because it was the only way that they could stay open, right? So what you find is that we're forced to care. Sometimes we don't realize it until we want to go to a restaurant and we're realizing, why is it taking so long for someone to take my order? Or why can't we fill some of these jobs? Well, or a lot of it is because of the lack of understanding on who the needs are and how they are interconnected to you. I wanted to take a step back, if I could, and just talk about this slide. Historically, when you look at affordable housing, it's often gotten a bad reputation because of what it looks like. Affordable housing in the traditional sense has looked like military barracks. You have these big boxes built out in a grid format, and they were done that way pretty much around the 50s, 60s, 70s, because it was cheap. Affordability, that math exercise that I talk about, is largely the rationale for doing that. But what we learned through time is that it didn't work because the people who were living there weren't comfortable. It didn't age well. It had all sorts of environmental challenges. And over time, it created criminal activity. It was a draw for that type of activity. And for the neighbors who had to live near them, it was a big eyesore. It was a big deterrent. So what you see now is when they hear affordable housing or any other terms that are associated with that, they automatically think of that, those military barracks. And who wants that in their neighborhood? So one of the things that, on that first slide that I was trying to point out was a practice that HUD and other funders of affordable housing have embraced. It's called crime prevention through environmental design. And at the most basic level, CEPTED, as they call it, is just a practice of integrating cameras and lighting to support public safety in a project. But when you bring design into it, you can go further to look at sight lines. How can you help people feel safe so that they can see beyond 10 feet? How do you use landscaping to open up an area, to create obstacles for that element of surprise if someone wants to rob you or attack you? How do you orient pathways and social gathering places to make people feel comfortable and invited? These are some of the practices that we challenge developers and sort of hold our carrot, that those subsidies of funding, up for. If you want to access these funds, you're going to have to figure out how to integrate these concepts and policies into your design.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, David. You know, I think a really important thing you hit on, you're saying, we talk about affordable housing, it's not just about the structures, it's about the residents. And that brings a really important part into the conversation if we're going on this concept of housing as a system and our urban design as a system. Then the residents are perhaps the most important element in that system, right? So Eric, where do the residents fit into the conversation? How can residents have an effective voice in these types of decisions that affect their housing, that affect the future of their community?
Thank you. Yeah, I think we have all realized over the last years, and some maybe before, that the future will be different from what we see now. I don't think, my personal opinion is not that it's going to be terrible, but we will have to be more modest, use space much more efficiently. We need houses that can still be insured, for which will be able to pay energy, and I think for this we will have to be innovative. And the residents play a role in this, I think, from many points of view, but I think there are two main ways. First of all is participating in discussion in a civic society which is strong enough to hold new ideas. And a maybe more specific niche way of doing this is to actually participate in development. So I think these are two different things. And for the first one, I have to say I'm not particularly optimistic for Miami until now. I've been here only for 12, 13 years, and I love it to a certain extent. But what I've realized, we are also in a city which first business is tourism and real estate, and I think there's nothing wrong about selling luxury apartments. It makes sense where we are, and there's nothing wrong selling the dream of tourism for a couple of weeks. But it doesn't help us, I think, to be particularly innovative thinking in other realms. So I think, what is the answer to that? I'm not sure, but I think that the work that we're trying to do, for example, here, this is like an exhibition. I don't want to pat on my own shoulder, but with other colleagues, student work that was done about the imagination of the densification of the West Grove, for affordable small-scale apartment buildings, which was in the women's club in Coconut Grove. So I think those things are quite important, but they are difficult to set up. For example, I tried to make this exhibition in an exterior space in the park in Coconut Grove, and didn't get very far. There were issues regarding safety. And so essentially didn't even get to a discussion. So I don't think we are the most open environment here for those ideas, to think in an innovative way. What is the way of living of the future? And once again, there's nothing wrong about, imagining this in the form of luxury apartments, because there's a demand and, money that comes in, but, it's not just that. And the second part that I think also, again, many of my colleagues have been involved in is getting residents to imagine new ways of housing, which I think, again, is important in a similar way. I think residents and small entrepreneurs, they have own interests that are closer linked to their work. While corporations, I think, can't afford this. This is not even a criticism, it's just a fact. At a certain point, you have a way of doing and changing this. It's very difficult. You don't get a loan, you don't know to whom you're going to sell it. You have, so I think trying to get owners involved in maybe redevelopment of their one-family site into small apartment buildings is something that I think at the moment is difficult to imagine because of the high interest rates and construction cost. And I wanted to mention this topic here, though, because I'm a little bit afraid that, we are forgetting about these ideas. And once, maybe the conditions are getting better again, we haven't changed anything. So I find it always impressive. I live in the North Grove, and like in many neighborhoods, I see like one house in my environment next to the other is of mediocre size, maybe 150, 1,500 square feet around that. They're being torn down, and they are being rebuilt with a triple surface, probably for a family that might have even less children than before, because that's the statistic. So that's a little bit awkward, and I think we all know this is not a vision of the future. And on the other hand, if you have discussions with some people why we could not tear down this one family house, if we have to tear it down, and change the zoning code, because we know that we have to densify, and maybe transform this into 15, 20, or 25 units, then everybody's just, saying, oh no, that doesn't work. So I find that difficult to understand. There's something wrong here. And so the discussion about what regulations have to be changed, that maybe a small apartment building is not as complicated and long to design as a tower, all of these are discussions that come out of, we could imagine to create even some kind of a unit which is helping owners to redevelop their land and to create co-housing ideas. My background, as you might hear, is partly German. So even though the co-housing efforts in Germany always will remain kind of niche products, if you compare them to the total percentage of production or number being produced, they have been extremely influential in just shaping the discussion and providing new visions of housing which get away from the standard. Oftentimes with architects being involved who combine that with a way of investing money, having space for their own practices. So I wouldn't overestimate how many units you can provide with that and how affordable they will be, but they have an impact on the discussion. So I guess I have been long, sorry.
Please, it's very, very interesting take and perspective on it. And I know we're almost out of time. We have to switch to the Q&A soon, but I do want to, Eric set you up quite nicely, George. What are your thoughts? How does historic preservation fit into the conversation? Do you think Miami either has an opportunity or maybe already has taken an opportunity to use historic preservation to address the housing affordability issue?
Thank you. Is it on?
Yes.
Oh. Well, yeah, it's beautiful setup. Thank you, Eric. So the first question had to do with how do we frame cities, right? And when you think of existing building stock, and you think of older cities, we were founded in 1896, so relatively young still, but you think of older cities. We love all those cities that have beautiful older building stock, whether it's Back Bay, Boston, or parts of New York. Of course, parts of New York are highly unaffordable to most people, but even Charleston or Savannah, that was still relatively affordable. But we have very little. I was going to say we don't. We do have that, but we don't have as much as those older places. And the interesting thing about them is that people were talking previously about social spaces and cultural connectivity, that those structures that exist here, like all of the kind of Art Deco two-story garden apartments in Little Havana, or of course the shotgun houses in the West Grove, or I grew up in a shotgun duplex in Grapeland Heights, right under the flight path of Miami International. There were fewer flights back then. So they have a DNA. Those structures have a DNA of a kind of social kind of profile that we're kind of returning to, not for the same reasons, but we are returning to. They were smaller. People didn't need 50 pairs of shoes back then, or wouldn't think of that. And I think younger people are less and less interested in all of that, more and more interested in efficiency and economy and such, and ease of not being overly encumbered. So they also come with a DNA of their accompanying urbanism. So most of these older structures are either 2 or 4 unit structures. They're fitted on tight lots. They don't handle suburbans very well, but that's okay, because everybody's riding the boards and taking. So I think we have this wealth of structures that we have tapped into. In my experience in the preservation field here over decades, we've seen a number of structures as high as up to 6 and 8 stories being converted to affordable housing. That was at a time where there were better tax structures to allow that to happen. So there's historic preservation tax structures. They're most robust in states that have state tax. And because we don't have state tax, we can't recycle that money as easily. But even so, at a time earlier, I would say 15 years ago, we still had grants, very, very good grants, robust grants programs. In fact, what was the Historic Preservation Advisory Council, because an attorney who was the dean of the University of Florida Law School negotiated a slice of the 1 penny transportation fund. That was, for 20 years, the largest grants program in preservation in the country. When I was asked to join the board, I said, #1? And they said, yes. I said, you sure the piece of paper is not upside down? Because we don't usually trend that high in these kinds of activities. So I think I'm optimistic, because I think these kind of gritty, historic, small-scale urban places are attractive to everyone. And we still have plenty of them here. What we have to make sure is that they're not collected, land banked, and then raised, right, for the larger investments to come through. And you were speaking, David, about HUD, right? And you were speaking also about the failure of urban renewal, right? And one of the great failures of urban renewal is that they did exactly that. They bought inner city land, they banked them, and then when the time was right, they raised all the historic structures, and more lamentably, they ripped out the infrastructure. Like they did it all over Detroit. At the National Trust, we were trying to have discussions about compressing Detroit and figuring out, which blocks are vacated to parks and which blocks are vacated on the perimeter to, wilderness parks and so on. So I think preservation has a very important role to play in that. And I know that Miami's a tough city for that, because even the smallest historic property, if it's in the right neighborhood, is astronomically unaffordable. But I know that like more recent neighborhoods, like for example Westchester, which is a neighborhood that was built in the 1970s, is now being repopulated by the young. And those homes, which are sort of like tract ranch houses, they're very well built, you know. They may not have the detailing that we see in older structures, but they're very well built. So James Jacobs once said in her book on streets that having, you know, a certain degree of urban vacancy was a good thing. And it was a little higher than most people thought she would say, which was shocking. And we're always concerned when we see urban vacancy. And I think her point was the vacancy tempers the extremes. So it mitigates the highest bracket of high prices because there are other shops that are empty. And it also brings in that entrepreneurial force, you know, that become sort of labs or places where young businesses can set up. I think we can think about housing that way. I think we can think about historic housing that way. You know, that a certain degree of vacancy might be okay, and they might be places where, as neighborhoods do, we see the first layer of regeneration. So, thank you.
Thank you. To my panelists, we're not going to get through the rest of the questions that we had planned, and to the audience, so I don't have a pretty bow to wrap up our conversation in. But since you all took the time to come out today, we do want to afford a few minutes at least for questions. Do we have a method, or I should just call on people? Sonia? I would take this question. Sure. Yeah, okay. Okay, we're going to start right over here, and then we'll come over to you next. Miss?
No, because we don't have you on tape.
Okay. Hello? Okay. All right. Thank you so much for being here and for the conversation. I heard your statistic at the beginning about 75% being zoned for low density. I'm just curious, as we start, you know, of course, pushing densification in order to provide more housing, how do we preserve the cultural heritage of communities like Little Haiti and Overtown? I just remember I was in Overtown the other day and saw the juxtaposition of a small building that was preserved because it used to belong to a school teacher, and then a high-rise right behind it. So we're preserving certain buildings, but how do we actually preserve the community and these cultures while we're adding new housing and hopefully making it affordable?
It's about preservation. So yeah, this notion of this kind of rupture of scale that you described in Little Haiti is pretty much becoming pervasive everywhere. And I think, look, if we don't allow density, we'll be plowing down the Everglades. And I think we all still drink water. So on the one hand, we have to densify. On the other hand, we have to watch the context of things. Otherwise, the nature of the place is lost, is completely remade and lost. So there are people that have been working here on this faculty, as Eric alluded to, this notion of small, it's almost like think locally, you know? So there are models that exist. I mean, in Coral Gables, for example, houses had a back house, which wasn't necessarily, some of them it was for people that would help the family. Other times it was for, you know, children as they got older. It was for all sorts of changes in the social tissue of life. They don't allow that. In fact, they prohibited it. So it was part of Coral Gables' legacy, and they wrote a code to prohibit that. And then a group of us over many decades started working with the city, and they now allow it again. And they actually give you an extra 400 square feet. That doesn't solve the problem you're talking about, but it is an example of how one can densify from within without changing zoning, underlying zoning, and without reconfiguring the lot. Maybe you want to weigh in on that.
Thank you. So the question you ask is probably the most important issue that I dealt with in my 10-year tenure at the city of Miami. And you've said it perfectly. How do you take a community that is in place and that has an identity, a cultural identity, and propose to that community that densification is necessary, and that implies that buildings that exist today that they're familiar with, that form part of their environment, that they're attached to, And some of those buildings will have to come down, new buildings will have to be put up. Those new buildings will respond to present day market demands, new people will move in, whatever culture exists may be diluted. It's extremely difficult. Here's a thought, and it's not an answer, it's really a thought, because I find your question very, very engaging. Over centuries, it used to be over centuries, now it's over decades or maybe over years. Densification is a natural process. What makes it a little bit foreign, a little more difficult to contend with these days is that it happens so fast, right? So if you accept that it's natural, that it should happen, that is the way to go, and there are a myriad resiliency-related, sustainability-related issues that also, I think, argue in favor of densification. What you're left with is, I think, this. To the fact that there is a community in place, if you can begin to identify what cultural elements form that community rallies around, and if you can devise new building types that respond to those cultural preferences, that cultural identity, then there is whether it's Overtown, whether it's Little Haiti, whether it's many of the communities that are low density and are prime by virtue of location for densification, there are building types that can begin to respond to those cultural preferences, and there are ways to ensure that that existing community identifies strongly enough that they are likely to attract other members of that community to come and join them too, right? Because, and I'll give you, and I'll be quick about this, I'll give you Overtown as an example. Overtown is a community that was decimated in just about every which violent way that it could have been, and there is still out there today, identifiably, an Overtown diaspora throughout Miami-Dade County, Broward County, etc., right? This diaspora, not surprisingly, but comes back very frequently to attend many the services at many of the historic churches that still are present today in Overtown. These should be, and are in many instances, historic buildings, preservation items, right? And so, why not densify? Why not infuse the Overtown community with new building types that are slightly denser, but that still respond to the needs and the identity of that community, and have it blossom once again? There are options, there are answers, and densification is not the enemy.
Can I just add one thing? So I sit on a nonprofit called Partners for Sacred Places.
I do want to take her question.
I'm going to do it really fast. And they look at how lands owned by churches in urban areas can be developed for the community. So if you want to look it up, it's Partners for Sacred Places. And they actually help historic churches do that. It's a national organization.
I know we are out of time, but since you've waited so patiently, please, I do want to get to your question over here.
After that question, if you can go to the one of the ones from the app, that would be great, because I don't want to ignore those that actually
and we are
use
going to
the app.
stick around after, so you can come up and ask us questions individually.
Please, go ahead.
Okay, I mean, we've been talking about beautiful stuff here, thank you so much. But there is one question to me. We are in Miami-Dade County. Miami-Dade County has an administration, it has a code, and it has a government. What is the policy of the government according to do affordable housing? I don't think there is none. And we do have a problem with that, because Miami was built by developers. And that's why we go miles and miles and miles of single-family houses, because that was the way that it was built. And it was built that way because we had roads and we had cars and all that sort of thing. But now we are in a conundrum that we cannot serve those people with public transportation. So I would like to know if any of you know what is the plan for affordable housing and what are the policies of Miami-Dade County.
Well, I will, as the only Miami-Dade County representative here, I'll take that question. I can't sit here and spell out all of the county's policies or action plan for affordable housing. I can tell you it's a top priority, and some of the other panels had our public housing staff at them. The very first panel was all about the county's policies on affordable housing and how much of a priority it is. And I'm certainly happy to connect you with our public housing director if you have some more specific questions for him, because it's a separate department from mine, and I can't speak to like the specifics. But yeah, he was here for the first panel.
May I add briefly to your response, and it'll be very quick, but it's an important question. To add to the complexity and to sort of underline how difficult it is to answer that question, yes, there is a Miami-Dade County government that has its own policies for affordable housing and affordability, and that is a robust set of policies. I have to say, it's a very sort of forward-looking set of policies that it's very encouraging to sort of come to know. That said, within Miami-Dade County, there are how many are there? 34 municipalities. The 35th is about to come sometime soon, I'm sure. 34 municipalities, each of which has its own affordability or affordable housing policies, and then the state of Florida has also seen fit to bring about, all in an effort to promote affordable housing, its own set of policies that have to somehow be reconciled with the county level policies and the municipal level policies. So it is a very complex regulatory system that we all have to contend with. That adds to the difficulty to some extent.
So let me try to answer this as succinctly as I can. Part of the challenge that you have with policies in built-out environments is that you have residents who are already living there. You have established communities, and then you come up with this new policy. Well, in order to integrate that policy or to adopt that policy, you've got to get the folks who live there, who vote there, on board. And many times it means acquiring land, it means rezoning land, it means buy-in from the masses. And in many cases, these communities that have large lots that are not very dense, the residents who live there wanted to remain that way indefinitely. That's why they bought their properties. You're messing with their way of life. So a lot of what you see Francisco and the folks on the in the housing department at Miami-Dade County and other cities or counties like that doing is what I call threading the needle, where they're looking for those infill opportunities. They're looking for those redevelopment opportunities so that they can supplement density with neighborhoods that are already built out. But writing the policy is the easy part. Implementing it's much harder.
So we're going to go to answer one of the app questions, and I know you've been holding your hand up for quite a long time, and you have as well, and I know Mr. Miller has as well. So if that's okay with you all to answer just a few more questions, that would be great. And then we'll wrap up with a sort of happy hour event. That will be you will be our last question. How's that for the evening as part of the forum? So quickly to the app.
Yes, so this is a good one for David, and it should be a quick one from the app. Where can people go to learn more about what our community is doing to help create affordable housing?
So it starts out with your city's website, but from a HUD perspective, you can go to the HUD Exchange, you can go to HUD.gov, and you can search for your city. And you can look at the money that HUD is giving to those cities, and then you can trail down to the plans that they submit to HUD. Right? Everyone that we give money to, the states, the counties, the cities, they're required to develop an action plan, an annual plan on how they're going to use those funds. And you can pull up those plans to see what they're doing as a starting point.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. whenever there's a shortage of something, I always think about, well, what do we have an excess of? And since COVID, there's been an excess of office space. A lot of very tall buildings in downtown areas are having trouble finding tenants. Are there any success stories in converting those to affordable housing? And another quick comment, when you talk about transit is very important, but please only consider permanent transit. In the case of Dade County, that would be Metro Rail, that would be the busway, Tri-Rail, Brightline. Don't think buses, because the bus routes here can change with the whim of a new director of transit. So just think about the hard, impossible to move transit routes. But we'd like to hear what your, any success in converting existing, maybe even historic. We know the courthouse days are numbered. Maybe turning that into some sort of affordable housing.
The courthouse is not going anywhere, though. I don't know if there, I mean, I don't know of any, like, hopefully we are going to have good examples of that in the future. I don't know, because you're right, it is an excess from COVID. Yeah, and I think it's maybe too soon.
Substantial policy and a lot of conversions. They are the 5 ranking cities. Miami, by its density, should be one of the top 10, but nobody here wants to deal with it. And it's very interesting, because I was just with the dean, because I'm going to be teaching a course just talking about that next fall. I have worked with some of the very large major architects like KPF, who have worked in this field, both on the West Coast and up in New York and so forth. There are some very big problems in certain cities, because the distance from the window to the core is so gigantic, you have non-habitable space. It's a lot easier, for instance, in London, where I've done a lot of these, because in Europe, they always have narrow office buildings. In America, you try to fill up a whole block. What you have to think is 18th, 19th century Europe, where they had super streets. They didn't have so many intermediate streets, and everybody ringed the housing around it, and then had a park-like setting in the center. You have to think of major buildings doing things like that, because that, and therefore there's a lot of space lost. The biggest problem is, of all the problems in the finances, the banks don't want to talk about it. If you're an owner of a major building, unless you're one of the big banks themselves, they don't want to talk to you about it. They just do not want to deal with it. So the financing is what makes it the most difficult. In the super blocks, it's a little bit less difficult, but it is attainable, and it is a very great solution in America, especially in major cities. I just wanted to hit on one other thing. You guys all talked around in a circle, but nobody talked about the fact that down in this part of the United States, the zoning is deplorable. There's no up-to-date zoning being talked about, thought about. Finally, they've cut down some of the parking requirements. But other than that, I've lived here now for 6 years after living around the world for 50 years. It's just, there is no zoning. Nobody knows how to approach zoning.
Francisco, you have some thoughts on zoning?
I would, and no zoning ordinance is perfect. We can certainly agree on that. I would invite you to have a look at the zoning ordinance we implemented in the city of Miami citywide, form-based code. It's called Miami 21. And I would propose to you, and incidentally, very briefly, I'll tell you that in the year 2010, after roughly 7 years of community engagement and participation, we were able to do away with an absolutely obsolete Euclidean zoning ordinance and went to a form-based code citywide, introducing new transects, new zoning designations to foster missing middle, reducing parking, favoring adaptive reuse of buildings, et cetera, et cetera. I would propose to you that is one of the better ones around these parts, and maybe even a fairly good one at the national level. But it's certainly very difficult because, and I'll say this again parenthetically, the, again, 7-year effort to try to get that zoning ordinance passed, the consensus building process, was exceedingly difficult because, and we're going to come back to the point that we've been discussing all along, culturally, Miami is so entrenched in its bipolar, either suburban or central business district kind of mental mode, that finding and defining in terms of the regulatory codes that missing middle, especially in mixed use, mixed income expressions, it took all of 7 years, and even then, to this day, public hearings are very contentious because not everyone is on board. Growing pains.
So in Los Angeles, what they force people to do is you own a piece of property, you own a piece of property, 30 people in it. Either you and your neighbor get together and build or work, help you build. And it's a real things like that. Forcing the issues, but they're very all this 5 stories of parking below major high-rise buildings. You know, all of that on the outside edges of all of those parking houses used to be by yourself.
Well,
You have to learn.
yeah, those are all.
Down here, I can't believe it.
Right. Those are really excellent points that you're bringing up. And it reminds us to be more conscious of how we as a community can expand upon those important lessons and successes, such as the Miami 21 Code, which thanks to Francisco's leadership was able to come to fruition, and it still stands today. So it's a testament to its being a successful code, and to the dedication of those that worked diligently for over 7 years to make that happen. And to answer the gentleman's question, I do think that we do have a few examples of office buildings that have been converted, in fact, historic ones in downtown Miami, right? So when we think about the Capitol building and we think about some of these older, smaller buildings that are along the Metro Rail line, the Gusman Theater had some affordable housing incorporated in at one point in time. I do think that we have examples that we can learn from. Do we need to expand on that? Yes, most certainly. And I think that there are great lessons for us when we learn how to reuse our buildings thoughtfully and successfully to meet our society's evolving needs, right? George, I think you wanted to add something, and then I'm going to give it over to our last question.
So earlier, I think you said that Miami it's in its second layer, right? Which is part of the problem. And I thought, okay, where does layer 1 start and stop, and where does layer 2 start and stop? And right away I thought, okay, layer 1 is 1896, the founding of the city, and it stops at World War II, right? And then layer 2 starts at World War II, and we're in it, right? And what happened after World War II is the Great American Suburban Project. So because of our youth, and like her examples of buildings that we're able to put housing in it are historic ones. Why? Because the DNA of historic architecture and urbanism is different, which is what I said earlier. And it's more like our values today and less like our parents' values. But most of our infrastructure is Donna Reed. Give me my car, let me walk out there, I want the picket fence, and that's what we have to figure out how to retrofit. But it's not because we're different or lessers, we're not lesser gods, it's a result of the accident of the history of our city and of the prosperity of that beginning of that second layer, right, of that time.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Riza Fernandez. I live in beautiful, historic National Treasure of Little Havana. I also work for a nonprofit that is dedicated to creating a healthier Little Havana, healthy Little Havana, right? And we're focused on the social determinants of health. And this question constantly comes up in my mind because I was born and raised in this neighborhood. My mom came when she was 8 years old, and they never left from there, right? So I live in a 1928 bungalow on a T4 in Little Havana. But do I want to knock it down? My heart tells me no, but everything around me tells me you better move fast, right? So the question comes to this, right? The reframing of design of cities in support of sustainable and cultural connected housing. I think that what we're doing right now in Miami is not sustainable and it's not culturally connected. It's more to what he said, luxury and tourism and selling of that, right? And that becomes an issue that's very hard because I think that it goes back to, and I don't think it's was mentioned very much here, is the way we collect revenue based on property taxes makes these land so valuable, right? It's not even the quality. I fight every day for a neighborhood that is clean, that has good jobs, because that's what my residents and my neighbors have, but yet they are more than 50% cost burden, right? And so how do we bring all those things, all those components? My focus in my organization is employment, is sustainable, is healthcare, it's education, it's housing. How do I bring that all to this, right? And one of my thoughts is, I think going back to that DNA of these neighborhoods, it's not, I always think, do we really have to go big in Miami? I mean, we have water. We could be underwater in 50 years, right? We're already seeing that already. So why do we have to keep, going big if we're gonna have issues with transit, we're gonna have issues with jobs and industry staying here, right? So that's a question, right? Do we always have to go big, or can we go a little bit west? Don't touch the Everglades. Let's think about the Everglades on the other end, right? But get these neighborhoods, Westchester, Alapata, Overtown, Model City, and we don't have to go super big, but we can go moderate, we can go sustainable, we can go culturally. Let's rehab, let's put these people in these neighborhoods to work and restore these buildings. And then they can live in it, right? But income is a problem. You're paying people here $30,000 to work. It's unacceptable. It's unacceptable. So I think that I would love to see, I went to a health and housing summit in November. The guy from the Federal Reserve in New York said, we don't need no more studies. We have the money. We need bold action. So anybody has some bold actions we want to put out there?
Well, I don't necessarily have bold actions because I have a lot of questions and not a lot of answers. But I will say it's interesting, and I agree, and the concept like we don't need more studies, but I am going to talk about a study that was done. A couple years ago, the National Trust for Historic Preservation did a study here locally called Little Havana Me Importa. Yeah, yes, I'm sure you were. And what I think was very interesting, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I was not directly part of that, but it's my understanding that it was a revitalization master plan for Little Havana, and they found that the neighborhood has the capacity to increase density without going up, without substantially changing the character, the cultural sense of place of that neighborhood. And I'm sure that's true in many, many neighborhoods. So yeah, and it's a conversation that we're having a lot at the county because the county is very interested in transit-oriented development, and as the county continues to adopt policies to incentivize development along our transit corridors, well, guess what? We have a lot of historic neighborhoods along the transit corridors too, so we have to really start looking at, okay, but how can we also incentivize preservation in the areas and balance. We're not like no development can happen, but we need to be thoughtful about it, and how can we really balance that, and how can we develop these policies that really consider that effectively? And like I said, I don't have an answer for you. I have a lot of questions.
I think that it goes back to investment. I think that the money has to be invested back into these communities, and not thinking about it just as affordable housing, but also thinking about it as a workforce development project. Historic preservation, jobs, green jobs, all that putting in, right? Imagine if we would restore 100 buildings of Little Havana, right? Or 100 buildings of Liberty City or Alapati. What does that mean, right? And that's not only on affordable housing, but that's health, because a lot of these buildings are old, they have lead, they have issues for health, right? So imagine this investment of money coming together. You know, I'm a dreamer, but I'm dreaming big because the guy said go bold, so.
So I have an answer for you. So, you know, the underline, the underline is a perfect example of the use of existing infrastructure for green infrastructure, right? So literally, if you took the first block or 2 blocks, depending on where you are along the metro, and said, we're going to rezone this, but the first iteration of rezoning could be what I was talking about, which is granular small steps, right? So if you could add a cottage, I know you're not along the metro rail, I know, but if you could add a cottage behind your bungalow and your mom could rent it, right? Or I can rent, I did add, when the law changed in Coral Gables, I added a micro unit that my son and his bride lived in for a year to save enough money to buy a house, but I could rent it. And if we work at the municipal level, all these people that are in here, we can put enough pressure at the municipal level, because I did with a group of others in Coral Gables to change it. They don't want me to rent it. That's the next fight, you know, because renters are evil. You know what I mean? So it's work, but we just say, okay, we're only going to do this for 2 blocks on either side of the metro rail, because it's an existing system, and they voted in the 70s for it. I think it was 60% in favor. They taxed themselves. They knew they would never write it. It was called the Decade of Progress. So we're going to make the Decade of Progress progress. It's not even rezoning. Let us just change the zoning code to allow little units in the back, and these people could rent them. Then you can age in place.
So let me build on that thought briefly, right? Let's assume that we can get past the zoning hurdles and we can find consensus in order to change the zoning and apply density. The next hurdle is financial. And the biggest challenge that we run into is that labor and material costs do not allow the market to develop affordable housing, right? Which is why HUD and other financiers are often in the deal to bring down the costs. Now, one of the things that I have seen in other cities to keep costs affordable, similar to what, give me the name again, George, was saying, is multi-tier properties, right? So it could be a house with an accessory dwelling unit, or in Boston they have triple-decker properties where a working force family owns the property, they live in one unit, they rent out the other 2, and with that rental income, they're able to afford to own it, right? If you want the cultural integrity to remain intact in some of those neighborhoods, you've got to have ownership at the table. And to make ownership financially feasible, you've got to be able to supplement their income with other streams of income, and rental is the way to do it.
So with those wise words, we're going to conclude a session that has clearly gone over, And that speaks to the interest that you all have in the subject matter. I want to thank all of our panelists because you're clearly experts and you've taken the time to be with us today to share that expertise. So we're very grateful here at the School of Architecture. We're always grateful to our partners at the U.S. Department of HUD for working with us to bring this to you. And we thank all of you for taking time out of your schedules to be with us to sort of enrich the conversation. We also want to welcome you back next week where we have the fourth panel. Maddie, the title is Thinking Outside of the Box. How do we design affordable housing? So it's clearly a session that's geared at looking at the architecture, but we are going to be looking at the different scales at which that can happen, from very high-rise solutions to those accessory dwelling units that were just mentioned. So I hope you'll join us again. And for those of you that are interested in the climate intersection with this conversation, I hope you'll join us for the final salon that will happen on Thursday the 29th, where we will be looking precisely at how those climate stressors and shocks are going to sort of impact our affordable housing crisis. So thank you again. Please stay behind and join our panelists for some added conversations. Thank you for coming.